By the beginning of 1945, the air war over Japan had reached a level of intensity never before seen in human history. The United States had completed its island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific and now possessed air bases in the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. From these distant outposts, American bombers could strike directly at the Japanese home islands. For Japan, this marked the beginning of the end. At the center of this campaign was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Unlike earlier bombers used in Europe, the B-29 was designed specifically for the vast distances of the Pacific. It could fly higher, farther, and carry heavier bomb loads than any bomber before it. Its arrival changed the strategic balance overnight. Japanese cities, once thought unreachable, were now vulnerable. Japan's air defenses, however, were unprepared for this new threat. Most Japanese fighter aircraft had been designed for lower altitudes and shorter interception ranges. Pilots often struggled to climb to the heights at which B-29s operated, arriving at combat altitude with reduced speed, limited fuel, and exhausted engines. Anti-aircraft guns also proved largely ineffective at extreme altitude. Despite these disadvantages, Japanese airmen continued to rise to meet the bombers. Fuel shortages, outdated equipment, and mounting losses did not stop them. By 1945, many pilots were young and inexperienced, rushed through training programs as Japan's veteran airmen were lost in earlier campaigns. Yet desperation created new tactics, some of them extreme. One such tactic was aerial ramming. While not officially classified as suicide, ramming attacks involved deliberately colliding with enemy bombers to disable them. Pilots aimed for wings, engines, or tail assemblies, hoping to bring down the massive aircraft even at the cost of their own lives. These attacks became more common as Japan's situation grew more desperate. It was into this unforgiving environment that one particular B-29 mission flew on January 27, 1945. What was expected to be another dangerous but routine bombing raid would instead become one of the most extraordinary defensive actions in aerial warfare history. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was not simply an aircraft, it was a technological marvel. Designed at enormous cost and complexity, the B-29 incorporated features that were years ahead of their time. Pressurized crew compartments allowed it to operate comfortably at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. Remote-controlled gun turrets, guided by analog fire control computers, enabled gunners to engage enemy fighters without being exposed to the freezing temperatures outside. A typical B-29 crew consisted of 11 men. Each had a defined and critical role: pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, navigator, bombardier, radar operator, radio operator, and several gunners positioned throughout the aircraft. Survival depended on absolute coordination. In combat, confusion could be fatal. Yet the B-29 was not invulnerable. Its four Wright R-3350 engines, while powerful, were notoriously unreliable. Engine fires plagued early missions, and mechanical failure was a constant risk, especially on long flights over open ocean. A bomber that lost more than one engine was often doomed. The aircraft involved in the January 27th mission belonged to the 497th Bombardment Group of the 21st Bomber Command. Known by its formation identification A-52, this B-29 was flown by an experienced crew who had already faced enemy fire before. They understood the dangers, but they also trusted their aircraft and their training. Doctrine dictated clear rules. If a B-29 lost 2 engines, the crew was expected to abort the mission. With 3 engines out, survival was considered unlikely. Formation flying was essential. A lone bomber was far more vulnerable to attack. On this mission, the crew expected interception. They did not expect what followed. As the formation approached Japanese airspace, radar operators reported multiple fighter contacts climbing rapidly. The gunners moved to full readiness. Engines roared steadily, and the aircraft held altitude. Moments later, the first enemy fighters came into view, and the mission changed forever. As the B-29 formation crossed into Japanese-controlled airspace, the tension inside each aircraft rose sharply. Radar screens flickered with contacts. Reports came in over the intercom, enemy fighters approaching from multiple directions. This was nothing new, but the volume of contacts suggested something different. Japanese interceptor units had scrambled aggressively. Aircraft such as the Kawasaki K-44 and K-61 climbed at maximum power, their pilots pushing engines beyond safe limits in an effort to reach the bombers. Fuel consumption was extreme, leaving little margin for prolonged combat or return to base. Japanese pilots knew the odds. Many had already seen comrades lost in futile interception attempts. Traditional attacks from the rear or below were often ineffective against the B-29's overlapping defensive fire. As a result, more pilots turned to head-on passes or extreme close-range attacks. Within A-52, the crew tracked the approaching fighters. Gunners called out positions. The fire control system linked turrets together, allowing coordinated engagement. Everything functioned as designed, at least for the moment. The first attacks were conventional. Fighters streaked past, firing briefly before diving away. Tracer rounds flashed through the sky. The B-29 shook as nearby aircraft exploded under friendly fire from other bombers in the formation. Then the pattern changed. Two Japanese fighters broke from standard attack runs and climbed directly into the bomber's path. Their approach angle was wrong for gunfire. Their speed was too high. Almost immediately, the crew realized what was happening. These pilots were not attempting to shoot the B-29 down. They were attempting to ram it. Ramming attacks were rare but not unheard of. They required absolute commitment and perfect timing. A miscalculation meant missing entirely or dying without effect. But when successful, they could cripple even a superfortress. The gunners opened fire, but the closing speed was enormous. Seconds later, the first fighter struck. The impact was violent beyond anything the crew had experienced. The first Japanese fighter slammed into the right wing of A-52, tearing through metal, fuel lines, and structural supports. One engine was destroyed instantly. Another was badly damaged, its propeller tearing free as the aircraft lurched sideways. Before the crew could fully react, a second fighter struck. This second collision compounded the damage. Debris ripped across the wing and fuselage. Engine instruments spiked and failed. Warning lights illuminated across the cockpit. The B-29 lost altitude momentarily as power dropped sharply. Inside the aircraft, chaos erupted. Crew members were thrown against their restraints. Smoke filled compartments. The flight engineer fought to prevent engine fires, while the pilots struggled to keep the aircraft level. In a matter of seconds, A-52 had lost two engines completely and suffered severe damage to a third. According to all operational doctrine, the aircraft was no longer combat capable. Many B-29s had been lost for far less. Breaking formation would normally be the next step, but breaking formation over Japan, crippled and slow, invited destruction. Japanese fighters circled, preparing to finish the job. The bomber was now the most vulnerable target in the sky. At this moment, the crew faced a decision that would define the mission. They could attempt to disengage and likely be destroyed, or they could hold together and fight. Against all expectations, they chose to fight. The pilot stabilized the aircraft at reduced speed. The flight engineer redistributed power, squeezing everything possible from the remaining engines. Damage control teams reported what they could. The gunners, seeing fighters lining up for attack, took control of the situation. What followed was not luck. It was discipline, coordination, and controlled violence. The most extraordinary defensive engagement ever recorded by a B-29 was about to begin. With A-52 badly damaged and falling behind the formation, Japanese fighters regrouped for what they believed would be an easy kill. In previous encounters, a crippled B-29 rarely survived long once isolated. This time, however, the attackers encountered something different. The B-29's defensive system was still functioning. Despite damage to hydraulics and electrical lines, the central fire control system remained partially operational. This allowed multiple gun turrets to be slaved together, concentrating fire on a single target. The gunners, trained extensively for such coordination, quickly adapted to the new reality. Instead of firing independently, the gunners communicated constantly. Targets were called out by clock position and altitude. Fire was held until optimal range. Ammunition was conserved. Every burst was deliberate. Japanese fighters attacked in waves. Some came head-on, hoping to exploit the bomber's reduced speed. Others attempted diving attacks from above, where gravity could increase impact force. Each time, the gunners adjusted. The top turret and forward guns proved especially lethal during head-on passes, where closure speeds were extreme. One fighter burst into flames after a short, controlled burst. Another lost a wing and spiraled downward. The bomber shuddered as spent casings rattled across the fuselage, but the defensive fire never slackened. What made this engagement extraordinary was not just the number of attackers destroyed, but the conditions under which it occurred. A-52 was flying on minimal power, structurally compromised, and completely exposed. Any further collision or engine failure would have been fatal. Yet the crew did not panic. The flight engineer continued monitoring engine temperatures, preventing fires that could have destroyed the aircraft instantly. The pilots maintained steady flight, avoiding sudden maneuvers that could have torn the weakened wing apart. The gunners remained focused, treating each incoming aircraft as a separate problem to be solved. Japanese pilots, expecting an easy victory, instead found themselves flying into an organized and deadly defensive network. One by one, their attacks failed. The battle was far from over. As the engagement continued, Japanese fighter losses mounted rapidly. Gun camera footage later revealed just how effective the coordinated fire had become. Attacking aircraft rarely survived long enough to make a second pass. Some fighters were destroyed outright. Others were damaged so severely that they were seen trailing smoke and fuel before diving away, never to be seen again. Escort fighters and nearby bombers confirmed multiple kills as burning wreckage fell through the cloud layers below. Inside A-52, the crew began to realize the scale of what was happening, but there was no time to celebrate. Attacks came continuously. Ammunition counters dropped, barrels overheated, hands numbed from cold and vibration. Despite this, discipline never broke. By mid-engagement, the crew had already accounted for more enemy aircraft than most bomber crews would see in an entire tour of duty. Still, Japanese pilots pressed on. Fuel shortages meant each pilot had only a limited window to attack before being forced to disengage or crash. Some pilots attempted near-vertical climbs for head-on collisions, repeating the ramming tactic that had already crippled the bomber. But damaged aircraft were harder to strike precisely. Defensive fire caught several attackers before they could close the distance. At least one Japanese fighter exploded so close to the bomber that fragments struck the fuselage, puncturing the skin and rattling the crew. Still, the B-29 remained airborne. By the time the final attacks ended, post-mission analysis would confirm 14 Japanese fighters destroyed by A-52's defensive guns. This was not an estimate or exaggeration. It was verified through gun camera footage, witness reports from other bombers, and later intelligence analysis. No other B-29 in the Pacific War would ever match this number in a single mission. Yet even with the sky momentarily cleared, the crew's ordeal was far from finished. The most dangerous phase, getting home, was about to begin. Once the last Japanese fighters disengaged, the reality of A-52's condition became fully apparent. The aircraft was barely controllable. 2 engines were completely gone. A third produced limited power and threatened to overheat at any moment. Fuel leaks reduced range dramatically. Navigation systems were damaged. Radios worked intermittently. The bomber was alone. The pilot faced a grim calculation. Continuing at altitude risked further engine failure due to cold and strain. Descending too rapidly could overstress the damaged wing. Every decision carried risk. The crew worked methodically. Non-essential systems were shut down to conserve power. Fuel was redistributed where possible. Injured crew members were treated with basic first aid while remaining at their stations. There was no escort, no rescue if they ditched in the ocean. If the aircraft went down, survival was unlikely. Still, morale held. What kept the crew focused was not heroism, but professionalism. Each man did his job because there was nothing else to do. Panic would change nothing. As the bomber limped away from Japan, clouds provided some cover. Anti-aircraft fire no longer followed them. The immediate threat had passed, but the aircraft itself remains the greatest danger. Every vibration felt like the beginning of structural failure. Every drop in engine RPM raised fears of total power loss. Hours passed slowly. Against all odds, A-52 remained airborne. As fuel levels dropped and the aircraft continued westward, the crew finally received intermittent radio contact with friendly forces. Search and rescue units were alerted, though their ability to reach the bomber in time remained uncertain. Eventually, the damaged B-29 approached friendly airspace. Other American aircraft flying patrol missions spotted it and were stunned by its appearance. Missing engines, torn metal, and visible structural damage told a story few could believe. The approach to land was extremely dangerous. With asymmetric thrust and compromised controls, any mistake could flip the aircraft or collapse the landing gear. Emergency crews prepared for the worst. The pilot brought the bomber in gently, maintaining minimal speed. The runway rushed toward them. Tires struck the surface unevenly. The aircraft lurched but held. A-52 came to a stop. The crew survived. When ground personnel inspected the bomber, the extent of the damage shocked everyone present. Many agreed the aircraft should never have stayed in the air. That it had done so and fought off so many attackers seemed almost impossible. Yet it was real. The mission of January 27, 1945 would soon be entered into official records. What happened next would ensure its place in history. In the days following the mission of January 27, 1945, intelligence officers and aircrew analysts began the careful process of reconstructing what had happened to A-52. Claims of aerial victories were never accepted casually, especially from bomber crews. Each claim required corroboration through gun camera footage, eyewitness accounts from other aircraft, and, when possible, intercepted Japanese communications. The results were extraordinary. Gun camera film from A-52 showed repeated confirmed strikes against enemy fighters. Several attacks ended with clear destruction, aircraft breaking apart, exploding, or entering unrecoverable dives. Nearby B-29 crews and escort aircraft independently reported seeing Japanese fighters destroyed while attacking the damaged bomber. When the final tally was completed, the number stood at 14 confirmed Japanese fighters destroyed. This was not an estimate nor wartime exaggeration. It was officially recognized by the 21st Bomber Command. No other B-29 mission during the Pacific War would ever record such a number. Investigators were equally astonished by the aircraft's survival. Engineering officers inspected the wrecked wing, damaged engine mounts, and compromised fuselage. Many concluded that structural failure should have occurred long before the bomber reached home. The fact that it did not was attributed to a combination of robust design, controlled flying, and sheer luck. The mission report emphasized discipline. There was no evidence of reckless action. Every decision made by the crew aligned with training, adapted intelligently to impossible circumstances. While individual gunners were credited with aerial victories, command reports stressed that this was a crew achievement, not the action of a single hero. The B-29's defensive system had worked exactly as intended, even under catastrophic damage. The story quickly spread through bomber units across the Pacific, becoming a powerful example of what coordination and training could achieve. The battle involving A-52 revealed more than American resilience. It exposed the extreme desperation of Japan's air defense strategy in early 1945. By this stage of the war, Japan faced critical shortages of fuel, aircraft, and experienced pilots. Industrial output had declined sharply, and replacement aircraft were often inferior to earlier models. Japanese fighter pilots were being asked to do the impossible. Interceptors struggled to climb to B-29 altitude, engines overheated, oxygen systems failed. Pilots arrived at combat altitude already exhausted, with limited time to attack before fuel constraints forced them to disengage. Ramming attacks, while not officially suicidal, became increasingly common. They reflected a reality in which conventional tactics no longer worked. Against the B-29's altitude and firepower, desperation replaced strategy. However, these attacks came at a devastating cost. Every ramming attempt meant the near-certain loss of a trained pilot and aircraft, resources Japan could no longer afford to lose. While such attacks occasionally damaged bombers, they failed to stop the overall bombing campaign. The engagement with A-52 demonstrated the limits of desperation. Even when ramming attacks succeeded in damaging a bomber, they did not guarantee its destruction. Coordinated defensive fire, disciplined crews, and robust aircraft design could still prevail. Within months, Japan's air defense capability would collapse entirely. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Training hours were reduced to dangerously low levels. By mid-1945, interception attempts became sporadic and ineffective. The story of A-52 stands as a stark reminder that courage alone cannot overcome overwhelming industrial and technological disparity. Japan's pilots fought bravely, but bravery could not compensate for strategic collapse. Within the 21st Bomber Command, the story of A-52 quickly became legend. It was not celebrated as a miracle, but as a lesson. Commanders used the incident to reinforce the importance of discipline, coordination, and trust in training. Crews studied the engagement in briefings. Gunners learned how centralized fire control had been used to devastating effect. Pilots were reminded that calm control, even in catastrophic conditions, could preserve aircraft integrity far beyond expected limits. The mission also validated the B-29's design philosophy. Critics had long argued that the aircraft was overly complex and fragile. A-52 proved otherwise. Despite losing multiple engines and sustaining severe structural damage, the aircraft performed exactly as its designers intended, protecting its crew and completing the mission. The crew themselves did not view their actions as extraordinary. Interviews and reports reveal a consistent theme. Each man simply did his job. There were no reckless maneuvers, no dramatic speeches, no moments of heroism detached from duty. That quiet professionalism became the mission's true legacy. As the bombing campaign intensified in the months that followed, stories like A-52 helped maintain morale. Crews understood that survival was possible, even under the worst conditions. It was not invincibility that carried them forward, it was competence. Today, the mission of January 27, 1945, stands as one of the most remarkable defensive actions in the history of aerial warfare. It is remembered not for its violence alone, but for what it revealed about modern air combat. A-52 was not a superweapon. It was a damaged bomber, flown by exhausted men, facing overwhelming danger. Its survival was not guaranteed by technology alone, nor by luck alone. It survived because of discipline. The crew trusted their training. They communicated clearly. They resisted panic. Each man understood his role and executed it under conditions that would have broken less prepared crews. The destruction of 14 enemy fighters after being rammed twice remains unmatched among B-29 missions. Yet the greater achievement was not the kill count. It was the fact that the bomber returned home at all. World War II was filled with stories of sacrifice, courage, and endurance. Some are loud and dramatic. Others, like this one, are defined by quiet resolve. A-52 did not change the outcome of the war by itself, but it demonstrated something just as important, that human discipline, combined with sound design and training, could overcome even the most extreme adversity. In the vast sky over a nation at war, one battered bomber refused to fall. And history remembers it.